Jade, and you're listening to the first episode of Youth to Use. Today I'll be discussing climate action in a pandemic. I wanted to look at things like the Climate Action Bill, climate deniers, how this will affect our futures as young people, and how local grassroots organisations are working throughout the pandemic. I spoke to two specific ones in my local area, an eco-UNESCO project, going on in Gaelcholáiste Curie, and Tralee Fridays for Future, which is my local branch of the Fridays for Future movement. I'm also a member of Climate Live Ireland, of which I will discuss later. You can't talk about climate action in a pandemic in an Irish perspective without discussing the Climate Action Bill 2021. This bill was proposed in the Dáil to reduce Ireland's carbon emissions by 51% by the year 2050. 2050 is about 29 years away, and that is a very long amount of time. I remember myself from being a child and hearing, we'll all have electric cars by the year 2030. In the year 2030, I'm going to be about 26 years old, and honestly, I highly doubt everyone will have an electric car and everyone will have stopped using coal. The Climate Action Bill leaves much to be desired. Fracking is never once mentioned, and that is a massive issue. That has massive implications on the environment, and it honestly has way more negatives than positives. But then you have people in rural areas saying that the Climate Action Bill is going to affect them disproportionately. I, of course, disagree with this, and so does Eamon Ryan, the Minister for the Environment. He said in a recent Dáil debate that he believed that it would be good for rural areas. However, you have climate deniers such as Michael and Danny Healy-Rae, who don't believe climate change exists and therefore believe that anything to do with climate action will disproportionately affect farmers, of whom their vast population of voters is. The bill also has no concrete ways of achieving these goals. Instead, we are relying on the private sector to cut down their own fossil fuels and to manage themselves. You have companies like AIB Bank that has pledged to be totally carbon neutral by the year 2030. Schools themselves have green schools committees where they can set up bans on single-use plastics to do in the school environment. But realistically, how is any of this truly effective in our world? If we take a step back and we look at the bigger picture, oil companies contribute the most to climate change, and people don't like hearing this, but so does agriculture. If agriculture is managed sustainably, it is wonderful, and we cannot live without agriculture. That is just a fact. But you look at oil companies who have been paying off politicians for years, and this is confirmed, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. They've been paying off politicians for years to deny climate change and to denounce climate change and to say that climate action isn't as pressing as it is. And in recent times, we have seen activists just like Greta Thunberg speak up and say this is abhorrent, this is unacceptable. We can't let this happen. We are the next generation. We are going to be feeling the effects of this much more than the people who are in charge now, the adults. We can also see that people in poorer countries are going to be disproportionately affected, as they already are. We are seeing nothing but extreme weather events as of recently. Within a space of a year, and we'll take America as a perfect example, within the space of a year, less than a year, about 6 months, the skies in Arizona were bright red, and then Texas was covered in snow. Texas is about the same longitude as about Spain. We've seen a steady increase in storms, especially here in Ireland over the past several years. Every winter bears new, bigger and stronger storms which threaten people that live on the coast, which threaten people that live inland as well. We have seen things just like the footage of Theresa Mannion, which is quite possibly infamous by now, where she is standing in the rain, holding her hood and telling us not to make unnecessary journeys. This quote has just been brought forward into the pandemic, which I find quite ironic. Taoiseach Leo Varadkar actually used this in one of his speeches at the time when he was Taoiseach, of course. While I was researching for this podcast, I decided I wanted to speak to two local organisations to really get the idea of what it's like to be working throughout this pandemic and still trying to get your message across. I spoke to two specific ones, Tralee Fridays for Future and Eco-UNESCO. Eco-UNESCO is the wrong way of putting it. I spoke to 3 TY students in Gaelcholáiste Curie who are doing a project for Eco-UNESCO, which is a competition. In a statement that they said to me, they said they are three teenagers from Gaelcholáiste Curie, and they are competing in this year's Eco-UNESCO Young Environmentalist Awards with their project Fiaushig Fast Fashion. They are currently preparing for the semi-finals, which will take place the last week of April, which is this week, so good luck to the three girls if you are listening. Their project focuses on the environmental impacts of the fast fashion industry, such as carbon emissions, water pollution and consumption, and the various problems caused by landfills. They are also highlighting the horrendous working conditions and unfair wages ensured by garment workers in sweatshops, where most fast fashion companies produce their clothing. However, their aim is not only to educate people about the problems associated with fast fashion, but also the many solutions we can all put into practice, in our everyday lives to become more sustainable and responsible consumers. Most of their project has been completed from their homes during lockdown. As a result, they have had to have creative ways when they are trying to spread information and awareness. They have their own podcast series, which can be found on their YouTube channel, Eco-UNESCO GC Curie. During their podcast, they spoke to sustainable business owners from around the country, such as Sharon Griffin from Oh by Gum, Paul Harrington from Juice Out, Jill and Gillian from Jill and Jill, and Taz Kelleher from the Useless Project. They also reach people in their community through writing an article published in the Kerryman and when talking on Radio Kerry. They created an educational video to help their school community obtain a better understanding of the topic and held a webinar with Release Fridays for Future to discuss fast fashion in depth. Throughout their project, they are regularly putting information about fast fashion sustainability on their Instagram at Eco-UNESCO GCC. I follow them on both my accounts, the podcast account and my personal account, and the information they're putting out in a simple, accessible way. They're perfect statistics. The posts aren't too long. You should definitely check them out. I also spoke to Release Fridays for Future and I asked them how have they themselves been working through this pandemic. They said it has been a difficult time for climate activist groups such as themselves, and they have not been able to hold in-person climate strikes, which is of course what Fridays for Future are known for. Though they really miss the amazing energy that comes from striking, they have worked hard to find new ways to raise awareness and demand action, such as digital striking, socially distanced poster striking, and Earth Day events. We have also been supporting other local youth environment groups, such as young people taking part in Eco-UNESCO. They have also focused on growing their movement, and this pandemic has given them a great opportunity to educate themselves. I'm assuming that final piece in their statement says to educate themselves on how the pandemic affects climate change and everything. I'm a member of the Irish section of Climate Live Ireland. We recently held a global event where artists from around the world came together and highlighted the pressing concerns of climate change for us. In Dublin, we also shone projections onto buildings and monuments bearing the inscription, "Can you hear us yet?" This motto in itself is so powerful. Can you hear us yet? We have been talking to deaf ears for years, those of us that are super involved in climate action. And I have so much respect for everyone that I know personally that has been involved with Fridays for Futures for several years now. For people that take part in cleanups, for people that take part in tidy towns, for people that are deeply involved in their own green school committees. We are the future. You are the future. If everyone comes together and keeps pushing and pushing for change, governments can't sit back. We are drafting proposals, bills have come out. The world is committing itself to ridding itself of fossil fuels. We are turning to electricity. We are turning to everything that we need to turn to in order to sustain the future for future generations. There is no planet B. We can't magically move to Mars and set up colonies there in the morning, no matter how much Elon Musk wants to. We can't move to the moon. There is no water on the moon. That is the bottom line. There is no water anywhere else. Humans are made to live on Earth. We cannot ruin this planet for us, for our future, and for our past. That is the bottom line of this entire fight. That is why we are fighting. We can't live in a world where all corporations rule the entire economic system. This isn't a laissez-faire. This is world. The governments of the world coming together. We have embassies like the UN, we have organizations like the European Union they always say they are so committed to reversing climate change, and they say they are listening to scientists, because if the global average temperature goes up by 2 degrees, that is irreversible. We are on track to that as it is. It's entirely unacceptable. Climate activists feel as though we're being condescended and we're just being tolerated, like, oh yes, you're there, but you're talking, but we're deaf. We can't hear you. We're the government. We've bigger things to worry about, like paying out that oil company that told us not to talk about climate change. That is how it feels. That's how it feels when you strike. That's how it feels with everything. And even in the Truly Fridays for Future statement, they said the energy that comes with striking, and I cannot help but agree with this. There is such an adrenaline rush that comes with it. But I guarantee you the adrenaline rush of knowing that fossil fuels were to be illegalized would be much greater. I spoke earlier on the topic of climate deniers, and I believe climate deniers fall into a certain category, and that category is that of people that believe the earth is flat, people that believe the Queen of England takes part in satanic rituals, and people that generally are conspiracy theorists and don't believe anything. These people generally are on the right hand side of the political compass, but that is not what this discussion is about. Climate deniers are so dangerous because they use their privilege of free speech to spread hate and unnecessarily and untruthful comments about the climate activism movement. Apparently, because teenagers are the main contributors to these movements, it cannot be taken serious. They build themselves to the public by cracking jokes like, well, the earth needs to get warmer anyway, I'm freezing, can global warming come around already? This is quoted by Donald Trump, quite possibly one of the most famous men on the planet. Thought spread, it leads to catastrophe for movements such as the ones I've been discussing. We are treated with less respect, we are laughed at, and end up being quite generally forgotten about. That's why it's so important that no matter what you do, even if it's just reposting things on your Instagram story showing that you do care about climate change, you will limit your usage of plastic. You do agree with this, you do support us, you do believe in us. And we will make a brighter, more sustainable future for everyone. This will help everyone. This isn't to hinder anyone besides all companies, but we know that already. And of course, get involved with any of the organisations that I've discussed in this podcast, very simply through internet searches. You will have noticed that this has been quite a short episode, and I hope that's understandable, because I have touched on everything that I wanted to discuss within this episode within these 11 minutes and 53 seconds. I don't want to draw out my statements, and I don't want to be repeating the same thing several times. This is obviously my first podcast, and my experience will grow as I become more comfortable with it. The subtitled version of this podcast will be available on YouTube before the week is out. You can find me on Instagram at UTUde Podcast, and you can find me on Twitter at UTUdeP. You can, of course, follow the Spotify or iTunes or Google Podcast, and everything helps. You can contact me on any of my social medias, and I really hope you enjoyed. And to any adults that may be listening, can you hear us yet?